like to read today from Hebrews chapter 9, and I'm going to begin in verse 24. And before I read, let me preface my remarks by saying the crisis that we're now in the middle of with the coronavirus and the quarantines and so forth is not the judgment of God. And please be wary of any Christians who start saying or telling you that this is God's judgment in some form or another. The thing that's dangerous about that, before we talk about why it's not, let me tell you why that's dangerous. It robs you of your confidence. It creates a sense of fear, creates a sense of unease. And without a doubt, this is not at all God's judgment. I myself have received certain messages from Christians during the last week, sort of trying to make that case that the coronavirus is God's judgment. One particular individual sent me a video, and it was saying that something along the lines of America is receiving its last call. And I'm not that old, though you might disagree, but in my short experience, I can't tell you how many last calls I've heard for America. It seems that for some Christians, the idea is just deeply embedded in their mind that God's mad at America, and God is just any minute now going to send down His judgment. Now, again, the thing that's dangerous about that is it robs you of your faith, and it's easy to extrapolate that if God's sending down judgment on the world or on America, that you're next. And that is not the case. God is not judging America. God is not judging the world. God is not judging you. And the reason we know that is because His judgment has already taken place against sin completely, as we're going to discover here from reading in the Scripture. I remember back when 9/11 happened, and I say this just to say that anytime a catastrophe, whether it be a tornado or a tsunami or some kind of natural disaster, it seems that some Christians are very quick to jump up and say, this is God's doing, God's responsible. And He's not. Even on 9/11, I remember watching television, as we all did after 9/11, and I heard two prominent, well-known, name-brand Christian ministers, and if I mentioned their names, you would know who I was talking about. That's how well-known they were. And they were on one of these news programs, and they were asked, why did this happen? And they both said and agreed that this is God's judgment on America. And I was appalled, frankly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, that anyone would conceive of this idea that God is like an infant having a temper tantrum, and because He's so mad because of sin, He's going to grab a couple of airplanes out of the sky and smash them into buildings, like a little baby throwing his building blocks around. Here's how we know that this is not God's judgment. His judgment has already taken place. And we're going to read about that. Oh, I remember something else I want to tell you. This morning, I'm not a Catholic, by the way, but I heard something that the Pope said that I really liked. And even though I'm not a Catholic, if I hear something the Pope says, I want to repeat it to you. Concerning the current crisis with the coronavirus and so forth, and I'm paraphrasing now, this is not a direct quote, but it was something like this. This is not God's judgment. However, it is a time in which we can make judgments about our lives and about what things are important. Because of the situation with everyone being sort of quarantined and you can't get out in public and do the things that we're accustomed to doing. What he's saying is we can reevaluate the things that are actually important in our lives and think through the things that we really need and the things that we really don't need. And so I agree with him. But the fundamental fact is it's not God's judgment. God has nothing to do with it. He's here to help, not to make things worse. Now, here is what Hebrews says. This is very important, by the way. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24. In context here, the writer is comparing the sacrifice of Christ on the cross to the animal sacrifices of the Old Testament, which we're told in chapter 10 of Hebrews, those animal sacrifices never took away sin. They had no effect whatsoever. However, they did portray and pre-shadow or foreshadow a true sacrifice that would take away sin, which is the sacrifice of Christ. So in verse 24 it says, Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor yet that he should offer himself often, as the high priest entered into the holy place every year with the blood of others. For then he must have often suffered from the foundation of the world. What he's saying here is Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is not like those earlier sacrifices. If it were, then he would have to offer himself again and again and again. And by the way, this pertains to you too. Anytime you feel the need for forgiveness of sins, you should know that it's already been provided. Jesus doesn't jump up and go to the cross every time somebody sins to obtain that forgiveness. Jesus went to the cross 2,000 years ago, and his sacrifice was so powerful and so successful that he obtained a universal forgiveness of sins preemptively for everyone, past, present, and future, and for you as an individual, past, present, and future. So as far as God's concerned, that sacrifice has already taken place. But here, I'm getting ahead of myself. For then must he often have suffered from the foundation of the world. But now, the text says, once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. This text tells us that Jesus has put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. What that means is he has removed it as a factor. He has taken it off the table, so to speak. To say yet another way, it means that sin is no longer an obstacle between man and God. It's no longer a factor in the relationship between man and God. And when I say man, I mean humanity. And I don't just mean Christians either. I mean the entire scope of humanity, Christians and non-Christians alike. God is not mad because of sin. God is not upset because of sin. God is not sending down judgment because of sin. That's what this video that I received last week was all about, detailing all the things that have gone wrong in America, all the abortions and all the this, that, and the other thing. And I agree, there's some things maybe are not right, but God's not mad about those things. As far as he's concerned, the sacrifice of Jesus has already put away sin. And now God is in the business of reconciliation, not retribution. And it's dangerous to suggest that God is sending down judgment on America or on individuals or on anyone for that matter. And where most of this mentality comes from, and let's just be honest and trace it back to its source, most of this wrong and misguided reasoning goes back to looking at the Old Testament and taking the Old Testament as a precedence and applying the precedents of the Old Testament to our current situation. For instance, people will talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, or people will talk about the flood, Noah's flood, and those were, we might say, judgments against sin, and say, well, see there, God did it back there, so he's doing it today. But he's not doing it today. Something has happened between then and now, which has changed the equation. That is, Jesus has come, as this text said, Jesus has come and offered himself as a sacrifice for sin. And he was so successful that, in the words of this text, he put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now, I'd like to read for you a story, just to illustrate this point, in 2 Kings chapter 1. And let me give you a little bit of background before I read here. This is 2 Kings chapter 1. The nation, what we think of as the kingdom of Israel, was united under David. And then when he died, his son Solomon became the king, and Solomon was reputed to have been the wisest man alive. However, when he died, when his son took over the reign and the rule of the kingdom of Israel, his son was a fool. And by his policies, the nation of Israel, or the kingdom of Israel, became divided into two. It was like a civil war. And the northern part called itself Israel. They retained that name, and that was the 10 tribes of Israel. The other 2 of the 12 split off, and they had Jerusalem in the south. And they were the smaller territorial-wise. So there were 2 kingdoms now. Jerusalem, this was the tribe of Judah and Benjamin in the south, and the northern 10 tribes calling themselves Israel. Yet they had no temple. They didn't have Jerusalem. So they made their own capital in Samaria. and they made their own temple. And this created a huge amount of animosity and rivalry between those two kingdoms. So now we're about to read about the king who is reigning in that northern part, in Israel. It says in verse 1, "Then Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. And Ahaziah," this is now the king in that northern part in Israel, "Ahaziah fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria, and was sick. And he sent messengers and said unto them, Go and inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease." Now, you'll see immediately a couple of things wrong. Number one, I don't know what he was doing walking around on a lattice. Any lattice I've ever seen, I wouldn't dare set foot on it, but it said he fell through the lattice, so we'll just set that aside. Anyway, he's ill. He has injured himself. Now, what's wrong about this is he doesn't say, go find the prophet of God and ask God, will I recover? He says, go over to Ekron and ask of their god, Beelzebub. Now, that doesn't sound very good, does it? So he's doing something that's horrendous, we might say, asking of this pagan god, Beelzebub. So evidently had a reputation of being a fortune teller or something like that. So these messengers, they go off to find the god of Ekron, Beelzebub. Verse 3, "But the angel of the Lord said unto Elijah the Tishbite, Arise and go meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say unto them, Is it not because there's not a God in Israel that you go and inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, Thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And Elijah departed. And when the messengers turned back unto him," that is the king, "he said unto them, Why are you now turned back?" Do you get the picture? The king sent out the messengers, go to Ekron, inquire of Beelzebub whether I'll get well or not. They don't get very far, and they run into Elijah, the prophet of God, and he says, go back to the king and tell him, here's what God says, you'll not recover, you'll surely die. So let's say 5 minutes later, they're back, and the king says, what are you doing back here so soon? You didn't have time to get to Ekron by now. And they said, well, we got a message from the prophet of God and saying that you'll not come down and you'll die. So let's go on reading here. Now therefore the king, they said, why are you back so soon? And they said to him, well, a man came to meet us and said, Go, turn again to the king that sent you, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Is it not because there's not a God in Israel that thou sendest to inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore now thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. Well, they got it right, didn't they? Word for word. That's a word-for-word repetition of what Elijah said to tell them. Now, do you think the king's very happy about this? I don't think he would be very happy about this, no. He said to them, verse 7, What manner of man was he which came to meet you and told you these words? And they answered and said, He was a hairy man. It's kind of a funny description. That's the first thing they said. It gives you a strange kind of impression of what Elijah must have looked like. He was a hairy man, and girt with a girdle of leather about his loins. And the king said, It is Elijah the Tishbite. Well, he knew right away who it was. He recognized this description, and he knew this was Elijah. Now again, do you think this made the king happy? Do you think he said, well, thank you very much, for this word from the Lord, and now I don't have to go and inquire of Beelzebub. I appreciate your concern. No, he was angry. And so it says that verse 9, he sent unto him a captain of 50 with his 50, and he went to him, and he sat on top of a hill. That is to say, the king got 50 soldiers and a captain and sent him out and get this Elijah and bring him in here. And he said, the captain of the soldiers found Elijah sitting on a hill, and he said, Thou man of God, the king hath said, Come down. They're going to put him under arrest, in other words, and take him in. Verse 10, And Elijah answered and said unto the captain of the 50, If I be a man of God, let fire come down from heaven, and consume thee and thy 50. And there came down fire from heaven, and consumed him and his 50. Now, this is an Old Testament story from the book of 2 Kings. And some Christians would mistakenly read a story like this and say, see, that's the way God deals with sinners. That's the way God deals with people who are doing wrong. and looking around in our modern world at all the things that they can find that are wrong, that they don't like. And see, this is what God's just about to send down judgment. See, this fire, we could say, is a kind of a symbol of judgment. And then anything goes wrong or any kind of crisis, like the current crisis with coronavirus, there's some Christians who'll say, you see, this is God sending down judgment. He's had it up to here, and he's really angry now. But what I'm saying to you today is that is wrong, and it's dangerous to take the Old Testament and apply it as a precedence, because something has happened to change the equation between God and man. Since that happened, and today, what has happened in between and intervening is, as we read in Hebrews this morning, Jesus has appeared and put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now, at the time when this happened that we just read about, Jesus had not appeared and had not put away sin. And there was no sacrifice for sin. You might say, well, what about the temple and those animals? Those animals, the blood of those animals never took away sin. That's what we're told in Hebrews chapter 10. It is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats can take away sin. There was no sacrifice for sin. So people who did wrong, like this king, they got what was coming to them, because it was God on this side and humanity on that side. And it's just the sheer mercy of God that everybody didn't get burned up with fire from heaven. But something has changed, you see. Jesus came and put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So he's put an end to this kind of activity. Now, just to make the point that Christians who would take an Old Testament story about the judgment of God and mistakenly apply it to our modern world, just to make that point, let's read a story from Luke's Gospel in chapter 9. This is Luke chapter 9, and now we're reading about Jesus and his disciples. Now, skip ahead hundreds of years from what we just read about in 2 Kings. Now we're in the ministry of Jesus, verse 51. Luke 9:51. And it came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers before his face, and they went, and they entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. Now, do you get the picture here? Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, but they have to pass through the land of the Samaritans, and they pass through Samaria, and he sends some of his disciples ahead of him to make arrangements. That is to say, go into this town and get us a hotel room and prepare a meal for us, and that's what's meant by this. Now, remember what I told you back in the days of the reign of Solomon's son. The kingdom was divided, and there was a jealousy and a kind of a rivalry between Jerusalem in the south and Samaria in the north. Remember, we read about that king of Samaria named Ahaziah, who fell down through his lattice, and he sent the messengers to Beelzebub, and Elijah said, "You'll surely die." And he sent the soldiers, and Elijah called down fire from heaven and burned them up. That was Samaria. And now here, hundreds of years later, Jesus and his disciples are going through that same place. And it says that he sent these messengers to make arrangements for him, verse 53, and they did not receive him because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. You see, when they found out he was going to Jerusalem, they said, well, that's it for you. We're not going to have anything to do with you. Now, this was very inhospitable. This was wrong on their part. They should not have been so hateful and inhospitable to Jesus. And so the disciples were angry. Verse 54. When the disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? Elias is Elijah. In other words, why don't we just do what Elijah did? You know, really, they're just applying the Old Testament precedent. What they're saying is, why don't we just do what Elijah did in the Old Testament? Isn't God the same in the Old Testament as he is in the New Testament? If he called down fire from heaven, Elijah, and God burned him up, these rotten Samaritans back in the Old Testament, surely he'll do the same thing now. What's changed? Well, let me tell you what's changed, what they didn't recognize. Jesus has come to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Jesus has come to bring reconciliation, not retribution. That's what's changed. The disciples didn't recognize it. And here's the sad, pathetic thing today. Many Christians who ought to recognize it don't recognize that either. They think we're just going right along with how things were in the Old Testament. But here's what Jesus said to them. See, bear in mind, let's just get this straight. These disciples wanted to apply the biblical Old Testament precedent to their current situation. But it's wrong to do that. Here's what Jesus said. He turned to them and rebuked them, first of all. He rebuked them. That means he chastised them verbally. He critiqued them. He said they were wrong. He rebuked them and he said, "You know not what manner of spirit you are of." He said, "You're even speaking out of the wrong kind of spirit." Just like Christians today who talk about God sending down His judgment are likewise speaking out of the wrong sort of spirit and don't really realize it. These disciples of Jesus were guilty of that. Here's what Jesus said, "The Son of Man has not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." Jesus didn't come to make things worse. Jesus did not come to bring down fire from heaven. Jesus did not come to bring down God's judgment upon humanity. That's because Jesus came to take God's judgment upon Himself for sin. So He offers us reconciliation and forgiveness and healing. You know not what manner of spirit you're of. All they did was try to apply the Old Testament precedent. Well, you see, to do that is wrong. You cannot do that. You cannot look at the Old Testament and say, because God sent a flood in Noah's day, or because He sent down fire on Sodom and Gomorrah, that He's going to do the same thing now. No, He's not. He will not. He won't ever do it, because He's already sent down all of His judgment on Jesus. Now, this is Luke's Gospel. Turn over with me to John's Gospel, chapter 12. Notice, you might be sitting there saying, well, that's just your opinion. Well, no, it's not just my opinion. Look at what Jesus said. Maybe, if you don't want to take my word for it, maybe you'll take Jesus' word for it. Listen to His language here. This is right before, just before, hours before going to the cross. And this is John chapter 12. And Jesus said in verse 31, "Now is the judgment of this world." Now please understand, when He said this 2,000 years ago, this is a 2,000-year-old now. Now is the judgment of the world. He didn't say, somewhere off in the future, 2,000 years, let's say, you'll all be dead and gone, but then the judgment of God's going to come. No, He said now, right now, He said, is the judgment of God. Now is the judgment of this world. And now shall the prince of this world be cast out. By the prince of this world, He means Satan. Satan enjoyed a situation of authority, and he ruled over mankind because mankind was guilty, and they were guilty because of Adam's sin. But now Jesus has come to put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself, and He says one of the things that's going to happen here is now the prince of this world will be cast out. Now this is just a side thought, but Satan is no longer acting in the role that you see him acting in the Old Testament. For instance, in the book of Job, you see Satan going up before the throne of God and having a conversation with God about Job, and they get into kind of a wager and a kind of an argument. God says, look at Job, he's a righteous man, he's my servant, and the devil challenges that, and he brings accusations against Job. And so Satan goes down and takes away everything Job had because he's trying to prove the point that Job won't serve God anymore if he takes away all of his blessings. Listen, sometimes Christians misapply that and think, well, I'm just like Job, God and Satan are having some kind of a controversy over my life. No, that's not true. You're not just like Job, because Job can't get up to heaven and fight with God about you. Satan. Satan cannot get up to heaven and fight with God about you. Satan has no access to heaven now. He's been cast out. The book of Revelation, which is not talking about future things for the most part, but things that took place at the cross, says that he was cast down to the earth. And now he's got no one to talk to except for you. And my advice is don't listen to him. But he can't get up to heaven anymore. Satan is down here on the earth. Jesus said, now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. This is a 2,000-year-old now. Jesus said, and I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. This He said, signifying the death He should die. When He said, if I be lifted up from the earth, speaking of the cross, lifted up on the cross, he said, I will draw all men, all humanity, to myself. The expression used in the Greek language for the word draw is to drag, like you drag a heavy weight. Why did Jesus say, when I'm lifted up from the earth on the cross, I will drag all humanity, draw them into myself? For the purpose of judgment, because there is where all of humanity's sins were judged, including yours. That was the judgment of God upon sin. That's why we read in Hebrews, Jesus appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. That's why he said, now is the judgment of this world. The judgment of this world against sin, the sin of mankind, took place 2,000 years ago at the cross. What that means is, because it's already done, God is now extending his favor and his love and his mercy and his reconciliation to mankind, not judgment. Things that go on in this world, like the coronavirus or like earthquakes or like floods, these are not the judgment of God. These are just natural occurrences, not to minimize any of those things and not to minimize the suffering caused by any of those things. But it's not God. God's not behind it. In fact, God is here to protect and to bring us through all those things. Now, one more, then I'm done. This is in Isaiah chapter 54. Actually, I'm going to read a little bit in chapter 53 first, because 53 comes before 54. Isaiah 53 is a prophecy about Jesus. How do you know? Because when you read it, you can recognize that things that we've been talking about, you recognize what he's talking about here. Look at verse 5. Isaiah 53, verse 5. Speaking of Christ, a prophecy, hundreds of years before the fact. Like I said, in the Old Testament, there was no sacrifice for sins. There was no mediator between God and man. There was no Jesus present. So it was God on one side, mankind on the other side, and his judgment was liable to fall. But Jesus came to put an end to all of that. Here's what it says in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was on him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. But the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Do you get what the message is here? The prophet Isaiah is saying, and God is speaking through him, saying that yes, you've got sins. Yes, you've got iniquities. Yes, you've turned astray. Yes, you've done your own thing. But here's my solution. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised. Not you, but him. He was bruised for your iniquities. The chastisement, and by the way, that means punishment. Another translation says, the chastisement that takes away our peace was on him. It says, all we like sheep have gone astray, but then it says, the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. Speaking of the sacrifice of Jesus that took away, as the Message translation says, everything wrong with us, Jesus took upon himself. You see, God doesn't look down from heaven and see anything wrong with you now because he sees Jesus 2,000 years ago taking it away. He's already executed the judgment for your sins, and now all he's got is your favor. Now, I just read from 53. Next chapter is 54. It comes right after 53. In the light of what we just read, listen to this now. I'm going to not read the whole thing, but it's all good. I invite you to read it later if you want to. I'm just going to get to the part I want to get to. Verse 9. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me. What were the waters of Noah? The waters of Noah were speaking of the flood, Noah's flood, which came as a judgment against sin. We just read that Jesus, that our transgressions were upon him. He was wounded for our transgressions. You see, the waters of Noah represent God's judgment. And here the writer, Isaiah, says, God speaking through him, says, this is as the waters of Noah unto me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee nor rebuke thee. The word wroth means angry. He says, just like when Noah's flood was over, it was done, and I put the rainbow in the sky and said, that's a promise that this will never happen again. It's all over with. He said, this is the same thing. It's just like that. Because of the sacrifice of Jesus, he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquity. Just like the waters of Noah will never be repeated, he's saying this judgment for sin that I have accomplished through Jesus will never be expanded upon or repeated. There's no reason to have any more judgment against sin, is what he's saying. He says, I have sworn that I will not be angry with you because of what we just read. You see, God has sworn, just like with Noah, and the rainbow being a guarantee that that judgment and those waters will never again cover the earth. He has sworn in the same way, I will never again be angry. There's no more judgment. I will not judge anybody anymore because I've already judged everybody in the body of Jesus. I will not be angry with you. I will not rebuke you. For the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed. My kindness shall not depart from you, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord that hath mercy on thee. So that's what we should have our attention focused on, the fact that God says, I'll never be angry, I'll never be upset, I've already judged your sins, I've already taken them out of the way. Now all I've got's kindness, now all I've got's mercy, now all I've got is a covenant of peace with you. That's what we should have our minds on. Now, in our current situation, number one, don't listen if anybody comes along and says this is the judgment of God. Hopefully I've given you enough information to arm you against that kind of thought. All you've got to have is Hebrews 9:26, that Jesus put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Secondly, know for a fact, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that God is looking upon you and your life with favor, with nothing but love, with mercy. He's already sworn he won't be angry, he won't ever be upset. He's here to help, not to hurt. He's here to bring reconciliation, not retribution. And in the current crisis, in the current situation, he'll bring us through everything that happens. There's nothing to be afraid of. Now, I'm not saying don't follow all the things they say to follow, don't follow all the ordinary precautions, but I am saying while you're washing your hands, while you're avoiding big crowds, while you're doing all the things you know to do, in your heart, trust in God, because God is going to preserve you and bring you through everything that's going on in the world. We've got a covenant with God that's a covenant of peace. And he's not angry, he's not upset, he's not put out in any way, shape, or form. And he'll bring us through everything that's going on. All we need to do is keep our trust in him.